In the spring of 1875, a man walked into a dry goods store in a small Kansas town and spent 40 minutes trying to buy a pound of coffee. Not because the store didn't have it, because he didn't have the cash, the storekeeper didn't trust his credit, and the nearest competing store was 2 days' ride away. He ended up trading 2 hours of labor, fixing a fence behind the building, for the coffee and a small bag of salt. He walked out, saddled his horse, and started the 3-hour ride home. That was a good day. That was a day something went right. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is not the version most people know. If this is the kind of history that shows you what life was actually like, not the cleaned-up version, not the Hollywood version, subscribe. We go deeper here than most. Before we go any further, here is a question worth asking yourself. When you think about everyday life in 1875, what comes to mind? Saloons? Gunfights? Wide open land and men on horses with a sense of freedom? Whatever picture you have, ask yourself this. How much of it came from a movie, and how much of it came from anything real? Because the actual texture of daily life in the frontier West in 1875 was not dramatic, it was not romantic, it was slow, difficult, repetitive, and shaped by a set of pressures that the popular mythology erased almost completely. The truth is harder than the story, and more interesting. Because what everyday life actually looked like in the frontier West in 1875 tells you something real about what human beings can endure, what they build out of nothing, and what it costs to build it. Start with the morning. On an isolated homestead in the Nebraska Territory in 1875, morning started before sunrise, not as a lifestyle choice, as a necessity. The animals had to be fed before the day's work could start, and the day's work was long enough that nothing could be wasted. A man or woman who slept until the sun was up had already lost an hour they couldn't get back. The first task was fire. The stove had to be started before anything else was possible, before coffee, before breakfast, before warm water for any purpose. On the plains, where wood was scarce, the fuel was often dried buffalo dung, called chips, collected and stacked during the warmer months. They burned reasonably well. They produced a specific smell that became simply part of the environment. You stopped noticing it. That process of stopping noticing was itself a kind of adaptation the frontier required constantly. Coffee was next. Real coffee, if the family had it. A bitter chicory substitute, if they didn't. The difference between the two mattered more than it sounds. Coffee was one of the small, reliable pleasures available in a life that didn't have many of them. Running out of coffee was not a minor inconvenience. It was noted in diaries with something close to grief. The next supply run was calculated. The days between now and then were counted. Breakfast on a frontier homestead was not elaborate. Cornbread or biscuits made from whatever flour remained, fried salt pork if the family had it, maybe eggs if the chickens were producing. The meal was fast. There was no time for it to be otherwise. The table was cleared before the food was fully cold, because the table was also the workspace for everything else, and the morning was already behind. Then the work. And this is where things change, because the work of a frontier day in 1875 was so varied and so total that it's almost impossible to map onto anything modern. A farmer didn't just farm. He was also a carpenter, a veterinarian, a mechanic, a plumber, in whatever sense plumbing existed on the plains, a fence builder, a tool repairer, a water hauler, a decision-maker about land and weather and markets and debt. Every one of those roles fell to the same person, usually a man and a woman working in parallel, with no backup and no specialist to call. A fence that needed repair couldn't wait for a fencing contractor. There was no fencing contractor. The man fixed it with the tools he had, using whatever material was at hand, while the rest of the day's actual work, the plowing, the planting, the irrigation decision, the sick animal, sat waiting. A piece of equipment that broke didn't trigger a parts order. It triggered improvisation. A broken axle on a wagon was a crisis that could cost days if the man couldn't fabricate something usable from what was on the property. Some could, some couldn't. The ones who couldn't had a very specific problem that the distance from town made worse every hour. 40 miles was a common distance between a homestead and the nearest town of any size. 40 miles in 1875 on a dirt track that varied from navigable to impassable, depending on recent weather, by horse or by mule or by horse-drawn wagon, was not a short trip. It was the better part of a day each way. Planning the supply run required thinking weeks ahead, making a list of everything that might be needed, and accepting that anything forgotten would simply have to wait for the next trip. Getting it wrong had consequences. Running out of lamp oil in November meant no light after dark. Running out of flour meant making different decisions about food until the next run. Running out of medicine, if the family had medicine in any meaningful sense, meant managing illness without it, which on the frontier was a frequent condition. But here's the problem. The town itself was not what people imagine. A town in western Kansas in 1875 might have a population of 300 people. It might have a general store, a blacksmith, a barber, a saloon or two, a livery stable, and a building that served as whatever the town needed it to be on a given week: church on Sunday, school on Monday, town meeting on Thursday. The doctor, if there was one, covered a circuit that might include 3 or 4 such towns. You couldn't count on him being there when you needed him. You couldn't count on his being there at all. The general store was the center of commerce, credit, and a certain kind of social information. The storekeeper knew who was struggling. He knew whose credit had stretched to its limit. He knew which families had stopped coming in regularly, which usually meant one of 2 things. They were doing well enough to need less, or they were in enough trouble that they couldn't afford the trip. He didn't share this information casually, but he held it. And the power that came from holding it, from knowing who needed what and who could pay, was a quiet kind of authority that shaped the life of every family in his orbit. Credit was the mechanism that made frontier life possible for most families, and the mechanism that made it dangerous. A family that planted a crop in spring was betting that the crop would come in, that the price at market would be enough to cover what they owed, and that nothing between now and harvest would go wrong enough to change the equation. The storekeeper extended credit against that bet. If the crop failed, and crops failed, from drought, from flooding, from hail, from insects, from disease, the debt remained. A family in that situation was working from behind. The next planting season started with last year's debt still on the books. The credit extended for this year's supplies came with interest, and the interest ate into whatever margin the next harvest might produce. Some families worked their way out of it, some didn't. Some loaded everything onto the wagon in the winter and drove east, back to wherever they had come from, leaving a claim that would be filed on again by the next family with the same hope. This pattern repeated across the frontier for decades. The mythology remembered the ones who stayed. The ones who left don't fit the story. Now think about the town on a Saturday. Saturday was the day people came in from the surrounding homesteads. It was the day the week's errands got done, supplies purchased, equipment looked at, debts discussed, news exchanged. The social dimension of the Saturday trip into town was as important as the practical one. For families who lived in genuine isolation during the week, Saturday in town was the only reliable contact with the wider world. A woman who had spent the last 6 days speaking only to her husband and children walked into the general store on Saturday and encountered other women doing the same thing. The conversation that happened in that context was specific and urgent. It covered children's health, crop conditions, news from back east that had arrived by letter or by newspaper, the state of roads and weather and water sources, and who had recently arrived or departed from the territory. This exchange of information was practical survival. Knowing that a well 3 miles to the north had gone bad helped you avoid it. Knowing that a family to the south had gotten through a difficult illness by doing a specific thing gave you a strategy if the same illness reached your household. Knowing who could be trusted, who couldn't, who was in trouble, who had resources, all of this flowed through the social network of the Saturday gathering. And then the ride home. 3 hours, or 4, or more, depending on where the homestead sat. Arriving in the dark if the errands took longer than expected, unloading the supplies, feeding the animals that had waited all day, starting the evening fire, making supper from whatever was simple because the day had already been long. That's Saturday, supposed to be the day off. But it gets worse when you look at what happened to money. The frontier ran on a barter and credit system more than it ran on cash. Hard currency, actual coins or paper money that held value, was scarce, not uncommon. Scarce. A family might conduct months of transactions entirely through trade and credit, with cash changing hands only when the harvest came in or a livestock sale went through. This scarcity of cash gave the richest men in town a disproportionate amount of control over daily life. The storekeeper who extended credit was also the man who set the terms. The buyer of the grain harvest set the price. The man who owned the feed operation, the land agent, the person who controlled access to essential services, these were not romantic frontier figures. They were businessmen operating in conditions where their customers had very few alternatives. A farmer who didn't like the price being offered for his grain had limited options. The nearest competing buyer might be 40 miles in the other direction. The cost of getting the grain there, the time, the feed for the horses, the wear on the wagon, ate into whatever advantage the better price represented. Usually, the farmer sold where he could sell and accepted the price being offered. The richest men in town knew this. They had built their position on knowing it. This is not the story of villains. Most of these men were operating within a system that gave them power and gave their customers little, and they used the power the way people generally use power when they have it, and their customers don't. That's not heroic. It's not monstrous. It's just how it worked. And understanding how it worked explains why so many frontier families ended their homesteading experience in debt they couldn't escape, even when the crops were good. Here's a question worth sitting with. Have you ever been in a situation where you needed something and the person who had it knew you had no alternative? A medical situation, a car repair, a housing crisis. That helplessness, that knowledge that the price is going to be whatever they say it is something most people have experienced briefly. On the frontier, that was the permanent condition of daily economic life for most families. The daily work continued regardless. In summer, the days were long enough to get most of what needed doing actually done. Sunrise before 5. Darkness after 9, and 12 or 14 hours of daylight in which to accomplish the season's requirements. The heat was the problem. On the plains in July, the temperature climbed into the high 90s and stayed there. Working in that heat meant managing it, starting the heaviest outside work before the heat peaked, taking whatever rest was possible in the early afternoon, finishing the remaining tasks in the evening cool. There was no avoiding the heat entirely. It was simply a condition that everything else was done inside of. The fatigue it produced was different from the fatigue of cold weather work, heavier, slower, requiring water that had to be carried from wherever water was, in quantities that added to the load. Drinking water was one of those things that sounds simple until you look at what it actually involved. A well-dug homestead had a water source on the property, but the well had to be maintained, the rope and bucket system that brought water up had to be functional, and the water itself had to be checked for changes in smell or appearance that indicated a problem had developed. A family whose well failed in summer had a serious problem with a short deadline. Water was also needed for the animals, in quantities that significantly exceeded what the family needed for themselves. A team of horses doing heavy work in summer heat needed water multiple times a day. The livestock pen needed it. The garden needed it. And hauling water by bucket from a creek or a neighbor's well over a distance of even a few hundred yards was an exhausting task that fell to whoever was available. The garden was the woman's primary food production responsibility on most frontier homesteads, and the gap between what a good garden produced and what it didn't produce was the difference between a winter of sufficient eating and a winter of getting by on very little. Knowing when to plant, how to manage pests without pesticides, when to harvest before weather changed, how to preserve what was harvested in a cellar that had to be dug and maintained, all of this was a body of knowledge accumulated over years, learned from other women, tested against the specific conditions of the specific land. Getting it wrong had immediate consequences, not metaphorical ones, real ones, measured in what was or wasn't in the root cellar by October. The harvest itself was a community event in ways that the mythology does capture, though usually without understanding why. Harvesting grain was time critical. The window between ripe and overripe, between good weather and bad, could be narrow, and the labor required to get grain in quickly exceeded what a single family could provide. So neighbors helped neighbors, moving from farm to farm across the harvest weeks, working together through the peak days, sharing food and work, and the mutual understanding that next year the help would flow the other way. This cooperation was not purely generous. It was mutual insurance. A family that participated in the harvest network could call on the network when they needed it. A family that withdrew, that took help but didn't give it, or that was seen as unreliable in the shared work, found itself without help when its own harvest came. The social accounting was kept carefully, in memory, if not in writing. A farm that had more hands than needed on a given day sent them to the neighbor. A farm that was short sent a message, and the help arrived. The transaction was understood to be recorded, not forgotten. And this is where things change, because the cooperative dimension of frontier life cuts directly against the mythology of the lone individualist who built something by himself out of nothing. Nobody built anything alone. The frontier mythology needed the lone pioneer, because lone pioneers make better stories. The actual mechanism of survival was collective, interdependent, and kept track of obligations over years. A man who had helped his neighbors through 3 harvests and then lost his crop to hail had a claim on those neighbors that they recognized and honored. They didn't help him because they were virtuous. They helped him because the system only worked if they did, and they knew that they were one bad summer away from needing the same help in return. That's not the romantic frontier, but it's the real one. Evening on the frontier homestead in 1875 had a specific texture that the mythology doesn't capture. After supper, after the animals were settled, after the fire was banked for the night, there was a brief period, maybe an hour, before the dark and the exhaustion made activity impossible that wasn't scheduled. In that hour, letters were written, or attempted. Frontier correspondence was a serious practice, maintaining connections to family and friends in the East that were otherwise invisible. A letter took weeks to arrive, and weeks more for the reply to come back. The conversation was slow and fragmented, but it was connection, which was otherwise scarce. Newspapers arrived in frontier towns irregularly and were shared widely. A newspaper from a city back east, even 2 or 3 weeks old, circulated through a community until it fell apart. It was read completely, not skimmed, but read, because news was rare enough that all of it mattered. The political situation, the weather reports from distant places, the price of goods in cities far away, the advertisements for things nobody on the frontier could afford or access, all of it got read. Books were treated the same way. A family that owned books owned a resource that was shared, borrowed, returned, and reborrowed. A novel that arrived in a frontier community might be read by a dozen families before it wore out. The frontier literacy rate was higher than the conditions might suggest, partly because reading was one of the few things that could be done after dark by firelight when the work was finally done. Children were educated in whatever way the community could manage. Sometimes a formal school existed, in a building or in a converted sod house, with a teacher brought in from outside. Sometimes the education was whatever the parents could provide at home, which varied enormously. Sometimes there was simply not enough stability or proximity to make formal education happen at all. A child growing up on a frontier homestead in 1875 learned a specific set of skills very early: how to manage animals, how to read weather, how to make do with less than needed, how to work through fatigue, how to assess what was actually dangerous and what was merely uncomfortable. These were practical skills developed in response to practical conditions, and they made those children capable of things that children raised in more comfortable circumstances couldn't do. They also meant that a child's work was part of the household economy from a young age, not as a choice or a lesson, as a necessity. A 10-year-old on a frontier farm was performing genuine labor that the family depended on: feeding animals, hauling water, watching younger siblings, working the garden. These weren't teaching moments. They were contributions, without which the household ran short. That's not cruelty. It's math. Here's the last question, worth asking. When we look back at the frontier West of 1875, at the actual daily texture of that life, what do we see that the mythology left out? We see the credit books at the general store with names that fell off the list because the family had gone back east. We see the root cellar being inventoried in January against how much winter was left. We see the Saturday trip to town as the week's social event, not a background detail. We see the borrowed labor at harvest time, carefully counted. We see the hour after supper, when the letter was written by firelight to someone far away who might get it in 3 weeks if the mail ran on time. None of that is boring. All of it is real. And none of it matches what ended up on television. The frontier West was a place where people built something enormous, and the building happened through small, daily, repeated acts of labor and cooperation and calculation. Not through dramatic confrontations, not through gunfights and fast straws and the theater of individual courage, through the coffee in the morning and the fence that needed fixing and the harvest that had to come in before the rain and the neighbor who showed up with his sons and his mules, because that was how it worked, and everyone knew that was how it worked. That is the story that got left out every time. It's a better story than the one that replaced it. It's just harder to make into a poster. The winter changed everything. On the plains in 1875, winter was not a season to be managed. It was a season to be survived. The first hard frost came in October, the last in April, and between those two events, everything on a homestead was subordinated to keeping people and animals alive until spring. Fuel was the first priority. The months before winter were partly about storing it, gathering buffalo chips, buying coal if the railroad had brought it close enough, cutting timber along creek banks and hauling it back. A man who went into winter with insufficient fuel had a problem that deepened with every cold week. The sod house did something useful in winter. The thick earthen walls held heat better than wood construction. The family slept close together, children bundled, animals brought inside in the worst cold. Dead animals were dead assets. The family accepted the conditions that came with keeping them alive. The cold also limited water access. Wells that were not properly protected could freeze. Hauling water in winter meant breaking ice, handling metal buckets in temperatures that made bare skin dangerous to expose for more than a few minutes, working through layers of clothing that restricted movement but couldn't be reduced without consequence. A winter storm on the plains was not weather. It was an emergency. Blizzards came without warning and produced conditions in which a man stepping outside to check animals could become disoriented in the whiteout and lose his way back to the house in 50 feet. A man found frozen 100 yards from his own door, having walked the wrong direction in blinding snow, was a story that circulated through frontier communities as a warning. The response was the rope, a rope tied from house to barn, maintained through winter, used as a guide in bad conditions. Simple, obvious. Once someone figured it out. The kind of knowledge that spread because not having it could kill you, and everyone knew someone it had killed. But here's the problem. Not everyone had gotten the rope yet. The frontier was large and sparse, and information moved slowly across it. A family that arrived in fall had not yet had a full cycle of seasons to learn from. Winter would teach them things no one had thought to explain before it started. Some of what it taught them they survived to use the following year. Some of it they didn't. The isolation of winter was qualitatively different from the isolation of other seasons. In spring and summer and fall, the work kept the mind occupied and the body too tired for extended brooding. In winter, when the cold kept people close to the house and the shortened daylight compressed the useful hours, the mind had more time with itself than the frontier was designed to provide. Men and women who had come west with energy and hope found that winter tested something different. Not the body's capacity for work, which the other seasons had already measured thoroughly. Something about the long dark and the confinement and the distance from anywhere that made a different demand on a person. The diaries kept by frontier women through winter months have a specific quality. The handwriting sometimes changes. The entries become shorter. The tone shifts in ways that are hard to describe precisely, but easy to recognize if you have read enough of them. Something pulling inward, a flatness where there had been engagement, a counting of days not to a destination, but simply forward, because forward was what was available. Spring mattered to frontier people in a way it has never mattered to anyone since. The first real warmth, the first mud, the first green, visible at the edge of the still brown grass, these things were not background details. They were the end of something that had been pressing in since October. The relief was physical. A woman in Nebraska who wrote carefully through the winter of 1876 recorded the first day of genuine spring in 3 sentences. She named the temperature. She described the sound of water moving again in the creek. And she wrote that she had gone outside and stood in the sun for 20 minutes without a coat. That was the entire entry. But those 3 sentences carry something that all the difficult winter entries don't. She had made it through. The spring planting began before the ground was fully ready, because waiting for fully ready meant starting late, and starting late meant the crop was still in the ground when fall came early, which it sometimes did. The calculation was constant. Plant too soon and lose the seedlings to a late frost. Plant too late and lose the harvest to early cold. The window was real and narrow and varied from year to year in ways that even experienced farmers couldn't fully predict. A farmer who had been on the same land for 5 years had 5 years of observations about that specific piece of ground, that specific microclimate, those specific indicators. He watched the behavior of wild plants and animals for signals about what was coming. Not because he was romantic about nature, because the wild things had been reading this land for thousands of years, and their behavior encoded information that was accurate if you knew how to interpret it. When the wild plums bloomed, it was probably safe to plant. When a specific bird appeared along the creek, the frost risk had usually passed. These observations were not infallible, but they were the best available information, gathered and refined through experience and passed along to new arrivals who were willing to listen. Some new arrivals weren't willing to listen. They had come with their own methods from places where those methods had worked, and they applied them without fully adapting to the new conditions. The plains were not the Ohio River Valley. They were not upstate New York. They were not wherever the previous generation had farmed. The soil was different. The rainfall was different. The temperature range was different, and the farming knowledge from elsewhere had to be modified or replaced. The farmers who modified and replaced survived and built something. The ones who insisted on what they knew from before had harder adjustments ahead, and this is where things change in a way that rarely gets acknowledged. The frontier Yim West of 1875 was a place of continuous, demanding, practical education. The people living in it were learning constantly about their land, about their neighbors, about what worked and what didn't, about how to read weather and manage credit and preserve food and build structures that survived the winter. Every mistake taught something, and the cost of the lesson was real. This education was not theoretical. It was accumulated in the body, in the hands, in the memory of specific decisions and their outcomes. A man who had made a bad call about when to plant in 1872 and lost a significant portion of that year's crop did not make the same call in 1875. The information was in him now. The land had put it there. That's what built the frontier. Not heroism in any theatrical sense, not the courage of the gunfight, the slow accumulation of hard-won knowledge, applied daily, shared when possible, paid for always. The small towns that began to appear across the plains as the 1870s progressed were the physical expression of that accumulation. A church that appeared in a settlement wasn't just a religious institution. It was the community claiming permanence, saying that this settlement wasn't a temporary camp of people who might move on. It was a place. People had decided to stay, to build something that would last longer than they would. A school did the same thing. A school said that the children being raised here were going to need to know things beyond what the land could teach them, that the next generation was going to have options the current generation didn't. The school was a statement about the future, built out of the belief that there was going to be one. That belief cost something to maintain in 1875. It cost something to hold on to when the crop had failed, and the debt was larger than last year, and the winter was coming, and the fuel supply was not quite adequate, and the nearest neighbor was 3 miles of mud away, holding on to the belief that this was going to be worth it, that the accumulation of hard work and hard knowledge was building towards something. That was not automatic. It had to be chosen, over and over, through the long dark and the mud, and the failed harvest, and the fever that came in March, and the child buried in April. The people who chose it, and kept choosing it, built what became a significant part of this country's character, not through drama, through the daily decision to stay and to work and to learn and to help the neighbor and to hold on. That decision, made by ordinary people in difficult conditions, without anyone watching, and without any guarantee it would be worth it. That is the real story of everyday life in the frontier West in 1875. Not what was on the poster. What was in the diary?